Chapter 7, 1982 to 1986. Going from the strongest and healthiest I'd ever been to so severely injured that I was unable to walk without help was hard to accept. There wasn't much I could do but care for myself and wait to get better. After being intensely active for months, being intensely still was confusing. My face was a mass of scabs that covered half my forehead, all of my nose, and a big section of my left cheek. I couldn't hear normally out of my left ear, and being unable to identify which direction sounds were coming from made me feel dizzy. I was easily startled because I couldn't hear people approaching me. My left hip was very sore and swollen with edema. I couldn't fit into my pants because of it. My head had been shaved in a spot where stitches held together the deep gash where I had smashed my skull onto the road. For a week, I lay in bed or sat on our lanai watching the ocean and humpback whales. I kept aloe vera nearby and gobbed it on my facial wounds every 10 minutes. I stayed close to the house because my hearing loss was disorienting and because it hurt to walk very far. I witnessed the power of healing when my facial scabs fell off and the skin underneath healed without any scars in less than 10 days. People who had seen me right after my accident were baffled. I became a lifelong proponent of aloe vera and felt better having my face back to normal. Not being able to hear normally was annoying, though. I made myself an appointment with an ear specialist and flew to Honolulu to see him. "There is a broken bone in your ear and it will never heal," he told me. "You are lucky you can hear at all and must get used to this." He showed me the x-rays of the cracked bone. I couldn't imagine getting used to it. Our friend Bill was at our house when I returned. I poured out my fears and frustrations to him. His response was surprising. I'd had serious hearing loss before from diving injuries, and it always came back over time. I've learned that bodies regenerate in ways many doctors don't understand. Try believing in your ability to repair the cracked bone. Try using your left ear and paying attention to your hearing, and see what happens. I was inspired and started wearing headphones every morning during my walks, and I would focus on listening with my left ear. I could finally get my pants on over the sack of fluid that stubbornly stayed on my left hip, but they were pretty tight on that side. Still, I was feeling better. After a couple months resting, Andy and I returned to our camper that had been stored at a friend's home in Los Angeles and began the art show season. It was mid-April, and we started in Oklahoma City with a well-attended and very profitable show. It felt like a homecoming as we recognized friends and acquaintances who were also exhibiting their work. All was well, except that I still felt disoriented and exhausted from my injuries. I assumed it was all going to be okay, but I had a small fear that perhaps I had a worse head injury than Dr. Turner had found and was going to die. I felt dizzy a lot, and though I knew some of that was from my ear injury, it seemed to be getting worse. I had occasional bouts of nausea. At our next show in Lubbock, I went to see a doctor. Andy stayed in the waiting room, and I went in and told the whole story of my accident and how since leaving Hawaii I was not improving and feared something bad. The doctor left the office for a short time. When he returned, he said, "Michelle, I think you're pregnant, and I need permission to examine you to confirm that." I was completely surprised. Andy and I had been together almost 9 years at that point, and our haphazard birth control had always worked. We both wanted children eventually, and apparently, eventually was now. I was 25 and Andy was 37. The examination confirmed that I was indeed growing a baby, and we began adjusting to this miracle. We left Texas and headed east. I had bought a book called Spiritual Midwifery and was impressed by the natural birth stories and the positive attitude of the author, Ina May Gaskin, who lived in and practiced as a midwife in a commune called The Farm near Summertown, Tennessee. We went there for my first checkup. It was a peaceful, joyful place, and they examined me and told me my due date was December 6th. When I explained our lifestyle of camper living and traveling to art shows, they gave me my health and pregnancy records to take with me, along with a comprehensive list of midwives they had vetted in every state. It was late June, and we started referring to our growing baby as the Iron Baby because Andy liked to tease that giving birth was my Iron Man. Every month or so, I'd make an appointment for a checkup at one of the midwifery places we had on our list. Our baby grew and we continued doing art shows. I had no complications or difficulties being pregnant, and it was fun to see midwives in Wisconsin, Illinois, and Texas. We were looking forward to going to New Mexico and meeting midwives that came highly recommended by some artist friends, Terry and Daniel. They had shared the story of their 2 successful births with the Taos midwives. They are so good at what they do, Terry told us. We birthed them at home safely, but the midwives also have an unusually respectful relationship with the local doctors, so you're covered either way. It reminded me of the harmony we felt at the farm. We drove to a friendly-looking building with a sign that had a stork painted on it. We met Tish and Elizabeth, the midwives. They checked me and the baby, feeling my belly with their hands. They discovered the baby's head was faced correctly and in a good place. I was 25 weeks along at that point. We'd like to have our baby born at home in our camper, I said, while we were being shown 2 comfortable birthing rooms. Tish looked at us skeptically, but was open-minded. Let's go see your camper and find out if there's enough space. Although it was a little smaller than what they were used to, they agreed it could be a possibility. On the positive side, Tish informed us, if you needed to be moved to a hospital, you'd already be in a vehicle. We all smiled. We left Taos and continued with all our art shows. When they were about 6 weeks before our baby was due, we decided to go back to Taos to have the child. On December 5th, my water broke. Elizabeth came right away and confirmed that I was in active labor. We have to drive to another birth, she told us. It's about an hour and a half away, and I think you should follow us in your camper just in case your labor goes really fast. As the day cruised by, it became warm enough to open a couple windows and let fresh air tinged with the scent of juniper waft in. I was at peace as my contractions continued regularly, but without pain. Andy made some soup, and we snuggled and waited for the midwives to come back and for our baby to come and make us a family. At last, Elizabeth returned and checked me again. You are progressing very well, but not close yet, she said. We drove back to the birth center. It was a dark and stormy evening, and we slept. At 4 a.m., I abruptly woke to my first strong contraction. When it subsided, I asked Andy to phone the midwives, and he went into the birth center to make the call. Tish arrived right away, and shortly after came one of her apprentices, a woman in a turban named Ravi Harkar. These 2 helped me successfully birth our baby. I remember locking eyes with Ravi Harkar and breathing in synchronicity with her. I remember the feel of Andy's hands on my shoulders and the sense of strength and power his hands transmitted. I remember pain, both sharp and exquisite, as my body was unleashed. I remember constant encouragement while a Van Morrison tape played softly. Our child was born with his eyes open, and Tish placed him onto my chest and into my arms. There wasn't a dry eye as he made his first small sounds and whimpers. Welcome, little baby, I said to him. Call him Brendan, Michelle, Andy reminded. That's his name. We stayed in Taos for 10 wonderful days of recovery and baby checkups. Brendan was thriving and had completely stolen Andy's and my hearts. After one last baby checkup, we promised Tish and Elizabeth we'd return in the spring, and we drove to Colorado. The first stop was Boulder, where my brother Jeff was a student. We went there so he could meet Brendan. Next, we drove to Aspen. My sister Kathy had graduated from the University of Iowa and was moving to Aspen in a few weeks. We drove to our parking lot home and were met with enthusiasm by all our Aspen friends. Andy started the process of looking for a winter job, and he found one tuning skis in the afternoons and evenings, and then getting up early in the morning to deliver them to condos and hotels in the truck his job provided. We asked everyone we knew and combed the ads in the newspaper for a rental place to live. I was learning the ropes of being a new mother and found our camper home was cozy, but not adequate without running water. We learned that our rental options had shrunk to nil now that we had a baby. People didn't want to share their home with a whole family and a potentially crying baby. We stayed in our camper. Andy worked and I cared for Brendan and cooked. One day when I was walking to the laundromat with Brendan in his snuggly front carrier and a huge backpack of dirty laundry, I laughed at myself. I felt like a pack horse. Many good things were happening, and I focused on those until one day, Andy came home and shocked me. Apparently, he felt like he was falling in love with a new friend of mine, Shelley, at the natural food store. He hadn't acted on his feelings and was telling me first. He told me he loved me and Brendan, but wanted to explore a relationship with Shelley and wanted to know what I'd do if he did that. My heart was broken. Those days were deeply sad for me, and I knew that was an unhealthy way to begin my role as a new mother. It was bad for me and bad for Brendan and probably bad for Andy too. After a week, I woke up as if from a dream, and I told Andy, I don't want to be sad anymore. You do whatever you want to do regarding Shelley. I have no idea what I'll do because nothing has happened yet. I imagine I'll leave you and strike out on my own with Brendan, but I won't know until something happens. I don't want to lose you, Andy told me. Somehow I had found my strength. I have no interest in living with you and Shelley. I have no control over you, so do what you will, and I will too. I'm a mother now, and I'm tired of being sad. I don't have the heart for any more sadness. And I didn't. I felt joy flood back into my heart. One day when Andy was at work, I was nursing Brendan and had too much milk. Brendan was taking in as much as he could, and I was soaking up the overflow with a cloth and laughing at my own abundance when it hit me. It wasn't true that I was not enough for Andy. I was not lacking. I didn't cause him to seek out another woman. He was the one who wasn't enough. He lacked confidence and strength. Perhaps being a new father had triggered some of this. I realized I couldn't be his second choice because I was his only choice. We were committed in love, even if Andy had insecurities. I now understood that. Being sad for a couple weeks was the price I had paid for my understanding. Andy had a longer journey ahead, but for now, he recognized that his feelings for Shelley were not true, and we came back together. We left Aspen in April and drove south to Taos, where we saw the midwives and a pediatrician. Taos seemed lovelier than I remembered. Our selling season went well, and we loved the adventure of being parents. We carried Brendan everywhere we went, and he observed the world from his safe perch in a snuggly or backpack. Before I got pregnant, Andy and I had a dream of building a beautiful home on the back of a big truck. We visualized traveling to shows in it and then living in ski areas. On one of our trips back to Taos, we found the truck we intended to build our home on and raise our child in. It was a retired water truck used for fighting fires in Alcalde, New Mexico. It was a 1960 Ford, and we paid $900 for it. It stayed in Alcalde until we were ready to pick it up, but we knew it would be a while because we were going to Hawaii for the winter. Brendan was such an active kid, and we couldn't imagine cooping him up inside during winter time. Our friend Bill owned an apartment building in Kona and offered us free lodging for the winter. We took him up on it and moved back to Hawaii just after Brendan's first birthday. Kona, 1983. Living in Kona was hard. Bill's apartment building was in a neighborhood called Hamburger Hill, which sat just behind a McDonald's. Bill hadn't been there for years, and the building looked neglected. We didn't have a car, but I did have my bicycle with a child seat on the back, and I'd regularly ride with Brendan to a beach dubbed the Baby Beach. Our life didn't feel like we were in much of a rhythm, and I was concerned that our dingy apartment was an uncomfortable place for us to live. I couldn't imagine hosting the guests we'd agreed could visit us that winter in that dark, ugly space. An art show friend who had survived the unimaginable tragedy of losing her husband and baby daughter in a train crash was planning to visit us. She and her 5-year-old daughter had survived the crash and were coming for a month to continue their recovery and rejuvenate in the safe haven of Hawaii. The idea of them joining us in our present accommodation seemed ludicrous. My sister and her boyfriend were also planning a week-long visit, and Sarah, a friend from my childhood, was supposed to visit too. Every week we looked at the classified ads, and every week we'd be disappointed, seeing only homes for rent far out of our price range or ones that seemed possible financially but didn't allow children. Andy was always really good at being the first one to get the paper, find an ad, and call before anyone else, and he did just that. "We only need one place, and there's bound to be one place available," he said. One day we got lucky. We went to the Bank of Hawaii and met with a friendly bank clerk who was in charge of renting a foreclosed townhouse at the Keauhou Kona Surf and Racket Club. We agreed on the price of $500 per month for a 2-story, 2-bedroom townhouse that was located on the ocean and included use of the pool and tennis courts. It was unfurnished and available immediately. I loved this place so much. It was clean and we heard ocean waves all the time. We could walk next door to a beach with great snorkeling, or head the other way along a golf course to a natural blowhole where the ocean shot up in a plume from an underwater lava cave. We were 6 miles from town. I could ride my bike to pick up some groceries, or we'd hitchhike up the hill to the natural food co-op if we needed a lot of food. The best part of all was that directly across from the club was a botanical garden that hosted a farmer's market every weekend. We were pretty broke after paying rent and deposits, but we had our bronze jewelry. Every Saturday we set up at the market and sold a few pieces, which allowed us to purchase a case of papayas, a case of avocados, a couple huge bunches of bananas, and a big bag of macadamia nuts. In Hawaii, instead of having some papaya with your granola, you just eat the whole papaya. And instead of having avocado in your sandwich, you just eat the whole avocado, Andy told all our guests. It's the opposite of the mainland, where papaya and avocado are expensive. Here it's the bread and granola that are expensive. We adjusted our eating habits very happily. We were beginning to meet our neighbors at the Surf and Racket Club. People would randomly stop by, and when they'd come over, they'd always ask the same question: "Where's your furniture?" We came up with an answer. Andy would say, "It hasn't gotten here yet." The neighbors thought we meant it was on the barge or stuck in Hilo, when in reality nothing was coming. We were content without furniture. Sarah was the first guest to arrive, and she was a joy. Each morning she'd heft Brendan into the backpack and haul him on to a walk to get her morning coffee. Terry and 5-year-old Gina were set to arrive the next week. We bought more food at the farmer's market and the co-op in preparation for them. We filled their room with fresh flowers and made beautiful leis to greet them. We had a problem, though. After paying rent and buying food, we had nothing left to rent a car and pick them up from the airport. Andy had $10 in his pocket, and that was it. In those days, one lived in one's means as a matter of course. Credit cards were not readily used except for dire emergencies, which didn't include picking up friends from the airport. The day of their arrival came, and we still didn't know what we were going to do. Carrying the leis, Andy and I walked to the main road, called Ali'i Drive, and stuck out our thumbs. Brennan was in his backpack on my back, and we'd left ample time to travel the 15 miles to the airport because we already felt horrible about not having a way to get them home, and at least wanted to be there on time for their arrival. We got a ride into town right away, but had to wait a long time for a ride on the highway to the airport. I was getting worried we'd be late when a flatbed truck stopped. I still remember how terrifying that ride was. I crouched on the flatbed up by the cab, and there wasn't anything to hold on to. We got dropped off at the airport entrance, and I couldn't imagine reversing that trip with Terry and Gina and their bags. One step at a time, I thought, as we walked into the airport. The flower leis were intact, and their plane had just landed. We watched for them behind the crowd and then wheedled our way to the front of the greeters. Mother and daughter held hands, and although smiling, grief's shadow still hovered. It had been less than a year since the accident. We placed the leis over their heads, the flowers a symbol of all we hoped to offer them. If only we could somehow get them home. It was too loud to talk as we collected their bags and hauled them to the front sidewalk. We sat on a bench with them between us, Andy and I catching each other's eye. It was time to confess that we had to hitchhike home. As Andy and I struggled to find the right words, a white stretch limousine pulled up from the curb in front of us. The driver was Hawaiian and dressed in a uniform. He called out, "Heath party! I'm looking for the Heath party." Andy and I were in disbelief. "Oh, you guys shouldn't have done this," Terry said. "We hadn't." Andy walked over to the driver. "Our name is Heath, but we didn't call you and have no money to pay you." The driver took a look at us. "Well, maybe it's a mistake, but my boss said to go to the airport and pick up the Heaths and take them wherever they want to go. If you're the Heaths, I guess it's your lucky day." His smile was dazzling. We got in and drove in comfort to the Surf and Racket Club. Eventually, we learned that the Heaths the car was intended for had been delayed. Their driver laughed and told us to enjoy the free ride. He'd return for the other Heaths later. Andy gave him the $10 in his pocket as a tip, and even though we had no more cash, we had everything we needed. Andy and I were able to keep our jewelry making going, and we all lived happily in our oceanside townhouse. Our days were filled with beach time, sunning, and pool time, cooking and making smoothies, and talking together about every subject under the sun. Andy left on most days to go up the hill to a friend's workshop and put in some hours polishing jewelry. Terry and Gina settled in and allowed the climate and gentleness of the Hawaiian culture to soothe them. There were several Alaskan families who stayed the winter at the Kona Surf and Racket Club. One family who Brendan had befriended at the pool were Inuit. They nicknamed him Bam Bam, who was the baby in the Flintstones, because Brendan was blonde and super active. They had brought real blubber with them, and blubber became Bam Bam's, Brendan's, favorite snack. The Kilauea volcano had started to erupt after many decades of being dormant. People said the goddess Pele had awakened. Brennan ate the last of the blubber with his Inuit friends. We packed up our bags and left our townhouse, still empty of furniture, to fly back to our camper and begin our art show season. Taos and art show traveling, 1983. Doing art shows with our baby and living in our camper worked well. In between shows, we regularly returned to Taos, at first only because the truck we had bought and planned to build our house on was there. Later, we realized we were really starting to like Taos. The vast landscape was so different from the cute ski villages nestled into the mountain valleys where we had lived before. We were discovering the vastness offered more possibility for adventures in all the different environments, as well as privacy. And although it wasn't love at first sight, we felt ourselves drawn back time after time. I learned to appreciate the ancient patterns and rhythms of Taos. It was a place that was off the radar for a lot of people, and intentionally so. The treasures of this land were hidden because the outer wrapping of glitter and glamour that lured tourists and second homeowners was not evident. There was just enough junk and rusted-out old cars and trucks in the yards of houses that tourists were not interested. Dirt roads kept all the cars dusty and muddy year-round. An abundance of trailer parks and an absence of generic stores and conventional people permanently deterred most tourists from staying very long. I liked the hidden beauty that came bounding forward as soon as one stayed long enough to see it. That winter, Andy stayed home a lot because he wasn't feeling well. At first, we thought it was just because of Brendan's teething pain interrupting our nights, but sometime it became apparent that it was something else. Andy's digestion was off. He'd awakened with lots of intestinal gurgling and seemed tired and grumpier than I'd ever known him to be. We had been estranged from Andy's father and brother Roger for years, but that winter we'd received an invitation to Roger's wedding in San Francisco. We chose to attend, and it turned out to be a wonderful reunion. Andy's father, George, was bowled over when Brendan, his only grandchild, jumped into his lap and explored his face with his tiny fingers. We met Roger's wife-to-be, Lenore, and loved her immediately. Andy's cousins and an aunt from England traveled to the U.S. to attend the wedding, and the entire experience was celebratory. Shortly afterwards, we returned to Taos and then left again to travel to the art shows in Texas. We traveled all summer and fall, doing art shows in states we'd never been to before, like Mississippi, Alabama, North Carolina, and Virginia. In June, we did a show in Virginia Beach and discovered a state park right on the ocean that offered secluded campsites and a pine needle running trail that went for miles, but had no electricity for polishing jewelry. We chose to use it as a home base for a couple of weeks, but knew we'd eventually need electricity. We treated ourselves to massages from a therapist at the well-known natural healing center, the Edgar Cayce Institute. My triathlon injuries were still very evident. I was not hearing well, and my fluid-filled, sore hip bothered me a lot. Our massages took place at the therapist's house, which was in a neighborhood a couple of blocks from the beach. After he heard we'd been at the state park but needed to find a place with power soon, he invited us to park our camper at his house during the day and pay a small fee to use his electricity so Andy could polish jewelry. One lovely day, when Andy was polishing jewelry in the backyard and I was hanging out in our camper while Brendan napped, someone knocked on the door. I opened it and saw a sprightly, dark-haired man with piercing eyes and a kind smile. He was dressed in casual clothes, and his voice rang with an unidentifiable accent. "I'm Alan, and I met your husband in the yard where I am camping. I am a psychic healer, and he told me you might want some healing work." "I have been stuck," I confessed. We agreed to have an appointment that evening. After putting Brennan to sleep at 7 and leaving Andy happily reading on our camper couch, I walked across the street from the parking area where our camper was set up and into the house where Alan was waiting for me at the kitchen table. I sat down, feeling open and hopeful. I told him about the triathlon and our training, and that I still couldn't remember my bike crash, but that I knew I'd left my body during my almost 24 hours of being unconscious. I told him I knew I'd chosen to return from wherever I'd been and knew I had a purpose for being alive. My hearing is still not right, though, and my hip has been holding this fluid and hurting on and off for over 2 years. Alan looked at me deeply and took a breath. Why were you afraid to finish that race? I burst into tears, surprising myself with my own emotions. We had gone to so many doctors. We had seen the head doctor at the University of Texas who specialized in my type of hip injury. We had seen alternative doctors and orthopedic doctors, and none of them had any idea how to help me. Finally, this man had asked me the right question to begin my healing. I cried and then sobbed and finally answered him, I don't know. He held my hand and kept very calm. It's either fear of failure or fear of success, he pronounced. We will find out soon enough. You are correct in knowing you are here in your body for a good reason. We talked for a while, and he prescribed me a flower remedy mixture that I was to take by mouth 4 times a day. We went upstairs to his temporary clinic and work area. I laid on the massage table where I'd received a massage earlier that week from the owner of the house, and Alan began treatment. He gently placed acupuncture needles in my skin, and I felt relaxed and hopeful. He did moxibustion, burning herbs close to my skin, and adjusted the needles regularly, placing them in and around my left ear. It was quiet and warm. Night crickets sang in the darkness. I'm going to use the purple laser on your ear, I heard Alan say. I was not asleep, but felt like I was floating in a peace I had not accessed in a long time. Alan used a wand that emitted a purple light and some heat on my ear and head. I felt enveloped in the competent, loving care of this man, and I let go into the healing he was offering to me. Sometime close to midnight, Alan removed the needles. I got up and walked back to our camper and quietly crawled into bed with Andy. When we awakened in the morning, the fluid that was in my left hip looked to be about 50% gone. I could hear perfectly from my left ear, and sound washed over me. I was energized. I took my flower remedy and shared my experience with Andy while nursing Brendan. So were you afraid of success or failure? He asked me. I still don't know, I answered. It's okay with me for it to be a mystery because I'm no longer afraid of either one. Alan became the healer we turned to for help over and over again, especially when Andy was faced with health problems that doctors didn't have treatment for. He always gave us new ideas and support for difficult health challenges. After we completed our art show season, we moved back to a rental house in Taos for another winter. When we were settled, Andy drove the Porsche to Albuquerque to check on the house truck, which he'd taken to a welding shop and interior repair place. The flatbed had been removed and a metal foundation had been built and bolted onto the truck according to Andy's plans. We'd also used our earnings that year to have the 1960 Ford truck cab completely redone with new seats and upholstery. Andy was going to pick up the truck and get it home because it was time to start building in the large driveway of our rental house. We had finally saved enough money to begin building our home. Taos, 1984. We loved living in our 1-bedroom rental duplex and very quickly realized that we wanted to move our bed to the living room and sleep near the Kiva fireplace. The house had a propane heater, so it wasn't for warmth as much as for the sense of comfort we felt from sleeping next to the fire. We had a big family-style bed, and we all slept together every night. The house worked well for all our needs, and we were looking forward to spending the winter skiing with little Brendan. Andy continued to have difficulty sleeping and uncomfortable digestion. He was frequently grumpy because of these ongoing issues. He had seen a few doctors, and no one seemed to have any answers, so we carried on. Andy worked building the house truck when he wasn't skiing. That winter turned out to be exceptionally warm and dry, so he got a lot of building accomplished. We decided to keep renting the duplex for the whole year while he finished the truck. Brendan, now 3, was able to ski the whole mountain that winter. The freedom we all felt skiing as a family of 3 was delightful. We discovered that after lunch, the Phoenix restaurant, which was on the ski mountain, emptied out. We would set ourselves up on the carpeted floor near a window and took turns skiing solo and staying with Brendan while he ate, played, and napped. Once, when he was napping and it was my turn to take a couple runs, I rode the chairlift with a ski patrolman. He told me that the patrol was going to open the hike to Kachina Peak the next day. Kachina Peak was 13,161 feet high and loomed majestically above the ski runs. It was accessible to skiers only when the patrol deemed it safe. Skiers could hike, carrying their skis from the top of the ski mountain for about an hour along a ridgeline, and then up some steeper sections where the patrol kicked rudimentary steps into the snow-covered trail. The reward was getting to ski down from the peak through powder and ungroomed snow. I wanted to do it. The next day, Andy and Brendan saw me off at the top of the mountain. It was a sunny day, and we planned to meet at a picnic table where there was an outstanding view of the peak. I set off with a ski instructor. We were required to hike in pairs. It was a glorious experience hiking along the ridgeline and seeing stupendous 360-degree views. The steeper sections required more attention, but when we came to the top, we had pristine powder in front of us. We put on our skis and jumped the small cornice into a heavenly run. When I got to the picnic table where my family waited, I asked Andy if he thought we could hike the peak as a family. We have the mountaineering child carrier backpack, and I'm pretty sure I could carry Brendan up if you carried all the skis, he said. We immediately went into planning mode. It was a cloudy, stormy morning on the day we planned to have our adventure. When we got to the top of the mountain, the ski patrol didn't give us any trouble about bringing our child up the peak with us. A man asked us if he could join our group and offered to carry Andy's skis. His name was Gray, and we were thankful he'd shown up, as it left me a more manageable amount to carry. We started on up the trail, passing evergreen trees. Brennan grabbed the branches that were at his hand level. I picked up a branch from the ground and gave it to him. He immediately turned it into a magic wand. Something we had learned from skiing with Brendan was that to a child, there was no such thing as a means to an end. Each part of any journey was an adventure worth putting all our energy into. Even the shuttle bus ride from the car to the chairlift was just as important and special as the actual skiing. At the top, the snow was excellent, with a few inches of powdery crud on top. We took our first turns together, with Brendan skiing between my skis. He made some turns on his own before coming back and making a few more with me. We made our way down, alternating Brendan skiing independently and then skiing with me until we got to the bottom. Brendan was cold, and although we were at the bottom of the peak, we were still at the top of the ski area, so we continued down to the restaurant and went inside to get warm. We felt exhilarated that we climbed and skied Kachina Peak as a family. I want to do that again, but not right now, Brendan said. We finished that winter climbing and skiing Kachina Peak with Brendan 2 more times. Both days were warmer and sunnier than the first time, and Brendan skied the whole way down by himself. We were reminded that we really could live our lives with our child, and so many of his limitations were only in our minds. Winter ended, and Andy spent intense days building our house truck. I started traveling in our camper with little Brendan doing art shows so Andy could work faster. I'd send him postal money orders from our earnings, and he'd use the money to keep building. I felt independent and strong as I drove away. I'd be gone for weeks or months at a time doing the art show work by myself. I traveled to Chicago, where my mom, sister, or a friend would take care of Brendan during show hours. I had to get more creative about finding babysitters when I headed to the East Coast, but traveling with Brendan was a joy for me. I loved being with him, and we learned from each other. As his mom, I taught him about how to live well and safely, and he also taught me how to make everything fun. Brendan showed me how setting up our booth and driving long distances could be as fun as playing a game, skiing, or being at the beach. As summer ended, we drove the 2,000 miles home to Andy and were thrilled with the work he'd accomplished on the house truck, but I was horrified at his physical condition. Always a lean and strong guy, Andy looked thin now, and his mood was dark. He had lost his patience with everything and was missing the sparkle in his eyes. "I'm not sleeping well," he informed me. After being on my own for a couple of months and feeling happy about what I'd been able to do while also caring for Brendan, it was really disappointing to return to Andy in this condition. I was Brendan's sole parent while away, and now that we were home, it seemed that was going to keep being my reality because Andy wasn't well. My sympathy for Andy was stretched thin because I didn't understand what was wrong with him. We argued a lot. I never got the happy homecoming I was expecting. Now that we were reconnected with Andy's father and brother, we learned the colon cancer George had been beaten 14 years earlier had returned. Andy flew to San Francisco to be with him. Were you able to talk through some of your differences and issues? I asked Andy after his return. No, Michelle, that wasn't necessary. My being there was enough and more powerful than words. We knew George was dying, and it would only be weeks or months until he left his body. Andy told me a story about his visit. I bought some raspberries at a farm stand in one of the small villages I passed through on the way to the airport. I was eating my granola for breakfast in the hospital room, and apparently George could smell the raspberries. Mind you, these were the most flavorful, succulent berries I'd ever had. The hospital had George on a bland diet, and the aroma of these raspberries roused him out of his morphine-induced stupor. Hey, he said to me, I'll have some of those. I fed my dad raspberries one at a time into his opened mouth. His face melted into a kind of ecstatic wonder as I placed them onto his tongue. Andy's presence and fresh raspberries healed many wounds. We were learning that there are many ways to heal. In Taos, we went to see a local healer recommended by some friends. We hoped she would help with Andy's health. Her name was Madeline, and she was from Germany. She muscle tested people for allergies and food intolerances way before this was common. Andy has a parasite, she told us. I have a way to cure it. Andy did her parasite cleanse, though it didn't seem to help him much. He remained sleep-deprived and couldn't put on weight. He did keep working on our house truck, but his energy was low and his attitude was negative. I was trying to find a way to do the fall art shows with Brendan and without Andy. I asked a new friend, Janet, if she'd consider traveling in the camper with us and helping me do the shows and watch Brendan. I was going to Arizona, Nevada, and California, and had figured out what I could pay someone over the 6 weeks we had shows scheduled. Janet agreed, and we headed west with enthusiasm. She was deeply involved with her boyfriend, who had his own serious issues, and I had Andy, who was not doing well. The feeling of driving west with another woman whose spirit matched my own and my son, who lived in joy and wonder, was a big relief. We sang songs, did art projects, played at beaches, and did the shows as a team that functioned without any conflict. While at a laundromat one day, we perused boxes of used books that the shop next door was giving away. This one might be good for Andy, Janet said, handing me The Yeast Connection by William Crook. I took it and put it in the camper without really looking at it. We were both missing the grumpy men in our lives, and Brendan missed his dad. We decided to make a detour to Taos for 2 days, then resume our art show travels for 3 more weeks. I dropped Janet off at her rental house, and Brendan and I drove to ours. The work Andy had accomplished was impressive. The floor and structures were built, and he was working long hours to get it enclosed before winter. It quickly became obvious that my surprise visit was a big interference in Andy's building momentum, and I was glad we only had 2 days there before getting back to the easygoing life Janet and Brendan and I had created. Part of why it was so easy was because it was temporary, and I knew that. But it was such a stark difference that made me think perhaps life with Andy might not be worth it. There was so much conflict and pain being in a relationship with him, and much of that came from his injuries and health problems that I didn't know how to fix. The morning we left, Andy and I had a serious argument. We were infuriated with each other. I knew he was suffering, but I didn't know how to help him. Brennan was already in his car seat when I remembered the book Janet had picked up in the laundromat in California. I brought it back to the house, and I threw it at Andy, shouting, "Maybe this book will help you." That was our goodbye. I picked up Janet, and we drove toward Las Vegas for our next show.